Hold her there. The order came flat and careless, spoken as if it were about a crate or a mule, not a young bride swaying at the end of a rope above a fast, cold river. And when she heard it, she clenched her jaw to keep her teeth from chattering, because fear made noise. And noise seemed to please the men watching from the bank. The rope bit into her wrists, rough fibers burning as it stretched taut between the cottonwood trunk and the crude pulley fixed to the bridge beam, her boots scraping uselessly against air while sunlight flashed off the water below, bright enough to make the danger feel unreal, like a bad idea no one had bothered to stop. Someone laughed and said she should have chosen better. Another muttered that this would teach girls to mind their vows, and the crowd shifted closer, faces sharp with interest rather than concern, because daylight made cruelty feel lawful. She tried to speak, to say she had done nothing that deserved this, that being left was not a crime. But her words tangled with the wind and fell away, swallowed by the river's roar and the murmurs of people already moving on. A man cut the rope slack, just enough to make her drop a few inches, the sudden fall yanking a cry from her throat before she could stop it, and that sound drew smiles, satisfied nods, the quiet agreement that fear was proof enough. "Leave her," someone said, and it landed heavy, final, the kind of sentence meant to end discussion, and as Boots turned away and voices drifted back toward the road, she understood with a hollow clarity that they were not waiting to see her fall, only to know they would not be blamed when she did. The river surged beneath her, flecked with white where it struck rocks, and she stared down at it, not because she wanted to jump, but because looking away felt worse, like surrender. That was when she heard a different sound, not laughter or retreating steps, but the crunch of boots on gravel moving closer instead of away, deliberate and unhurried. And when she lifted her head, squinting against the glare, she saw the mountain man standing apart from the others, tall and broad-shouldered, his beard catching the light, his eyes fixed on the rope rather than the men who had tied it. "You don't want this," someone warned him, voice edged with irritation, and another added that it was none of his concern, but he did not answer them, did not argue or threaten, only stepped to the edge and looked at her. Then, really looked, not at the knots or the bruises forming on her wrists, but at her face. Drawn tight with terror, she refused to let spill into begging. "If you fall," he said quietly, not to the crowd, but to her, "it won't be because you were guilty." And the words hit harder than any shove because they named what the daylight had tried to hide. The river roared on, the rope creaked, and as the last of the onlookers turned their backs, the mountain man shifted his weight forward, measuring distance and consequence in the same breath. And she realized in that suspended moment that while everyone else had chosen to leave, one man was deciding whether to step into a risk that would change everything before the water below could finish the choice for him. The rope groaned as the river tugged at the air beneath her, the sound steady and patient, as if water itself were keeping score, and she felt every second stretch long enough to hurt, the burn in her wrists sharpening with each small sway. Above her, the cottonwood leaves whispered in the heat, indifferent witnesses, and the bridge beam creaked when someone shifted their weight, a reminder that the knot holding her was never meant to last, only to threaten. The men who had done this lingered at a distance now, talking louder than necessary about nothing in particular, the way people did when they wanted to pretend they hadn't left a life dangling behind them. And one of them said the river would decide soon enough, which drew a laugh that ended too quickly. The mountain man crouched at the edge, eyes tracing the rope's path from trunk to pulley, to the line biting into her skin, his hands flexing once as if testing memory rather than strength, and she watched him, because watching the water made her dizzy and watching the men made her smaller. "Don't," someone called out, not kindly, warning him that accidents happened near fast water, that blame had a way of finding men who interfered, and he nodded as if acknowledging weather, not advice. Then glanced back at her with a look that was not promise but calculation, the honest kind that weighed loss as carefully as hope. A breeze rose off the river and carried her dress against her legs, cold spray freckling the hem, and she tasted iron where she'd bitten her lip to keep quiet, the effort of not begging costing more than the pain. The mountain man rose and took a step onto the beam, Boots finding purchase where others saw risk, and the bridge complained under his weight, a long wooden sigh that made the men on the bank stiffen. "Last chance," one of them said, and there it was again, the lie dressed as mercy. But the mountain man did not turn, did not answer, only set his heel and shifted his balance so the beam steadied, his eyes now on the knot at the trunk, frayed fibers shining pale in the sun. She felt the rope slip a fraction, a small, terrifying inch, and a sound tore out of her before she could stop it, half breath, half prayer, and the mountain man lifted a hand, not to hush her, but to signal patience, a silent instruction to wait while he measured the angle of fall, the pull of current, the distance he could cover before the river claimed what the crowd had abandoned. He murmured something under his breath. She couldn't hear, then reached for the knife at his belt and stopped, reconsidered, eyes flicking to the knot again, because cutting wrong could snap the line and end it all at once. The river surged louder, impatient, and she closed her eyes for a heartbeat, bracing for the drop. But when she opened them, the mountain man was already moving, muscles coiled, one hand sliding along the rope toward the trunk, while his other gripped the beam, and in that instant, between the water's roar and the men's shouts, she understood that the risk he was taking wasn't just the fall, but the certainty that once he committed, there would be no turning back for either of them. The moment the mountain man shifted his weight fully onto the beam, the crowd's patience snapped into noise, shouts spilling over one another as men realized too late that watching had turned into consequence, and someone yelled that he was a fool, that the rope could take them both, that the river would finish what they had started. But none of it slowed him, because hesitation now would be deadlier than the fall. The beam vibrated beneath his boots, each step deliberate as he edged closer to the trunk where the rope was anchored, his free hand sliding along the line to feel its strain, its age, the places where fiber had already begun to give. And she felt every movement echo through her wrists, the tension changing with his progress, tightening, then easing just enough to keep her from spinning. The water below surged against the rocks in white bursts, loud and unforgiving, and she forced herself to breathe shallow and steady, because any sudden movement could pull the line off balance, could turn his careful calculation into disaster. A man on the bank reached for the rope as if to stop him, then froze when the mountain man's eyes lifted, sharp and warning, not violent but final. The look of someone who had already crossed the point where threats mattered. He reached the trunk and braced his shoulder against it, testing the knot with his fingers, feeling where it bit into bark, where it could be loosened without sending everything loose at once. And for a heartbeat, he closed his eyes, committing the sequence to memory, because mistakes here would not forgive themselves. She watched his hands, rough and scarred, working with a gentleness that felt almost impossible under the circumstances, and when the knot resisted, he shifted his grip and leaned back, using his weight to change the angle, the rope groaning in protest as the pressure redistributed. Someone screamed for him to stop, another shouted that it wasn't worth it, and the words struck her like blows meant for him, because she understood what they really said, that a life like hers could never balance the cost of his risk. The mountain man spoke then, voice low but carrying, saying that worth was decided by action, not by who stayed to watch. And with that, he reached for his knife, not to cut clean through, but to score the rope just enough to weaken it without snapping, each careful slice measured against the river's pull. She felt the fibers give in small, terrifying jerks, the line stretching longer, her body dropping inches at a time, and panic flared until he met her eyes again and nodded once, a promise made without words. The crowd fell silent, the spectacle turning into something they had not planned to witness, and in that charged stillness, the mountain man made his final move, loosening the knot just enough to let the rope slide through his hands under control, lowering her toward the water's edge rather than letting gravity decide. And as her boots finally struck the shallow bank with a splash, knees buckling but body intact, she understood that the true risk he had taken was not the fall or the blade, but the choice to act when everyone else had chosen to leave, knowing that once he touched that rope, there would be no denying what he had done or who he had stood for when daylight returned its verdict. The relief barely had time to settle before it curdled into something sharper, because the moment her boots found ground and the rope slackened in the mountain man's hands, the crowd remembered itself and decided it needed a new balance, voices rising not in celebration but accusation as men stepped forward with faces set hard by embarrassment. Someone shouted that he had interfered with justice, another that the river had been meant to teach a lesson, and the sheriff finally moved from the shade with the purposeful stride of authority arriving late, his eyes sliding past the bride to fix on the mountain man as if the rescue itself were the greater offense. The mountain man stepped off the beam and planted his boots in the gravel, putting himself squarely between her and the water, his shoulder angled just enough to block the nearest men without touching them, and the posture said plainly that whatever came next would have to come through him. The sheriff demanded to know what right he thought he had, his voice calm and practiced, and the mountain man answered that no right was needed to stop a killing, the words simple enough to strip the argument bare. Laughter broke out again, thinner now, edged with nerves, and someone muttered that she should have died if she was meant to, that fate had rules, and the mountain man turned his head slowly toward the sound, asking whether fate now wore boots and spoke with borrowed courage, a question that drew a few uneasy looks away. The bride stood behind him, shaking hard enough that she had to brace a hand against a rock, the river spray cold on her calves, and she realized that the danger had not ended, only changed direction, because daylight that spared one life often demanded another in exchange. The sheriff announced that the mountain man would answer for this, that taking matters into his own hands invited disorder, and as he spoke the crowd edged closer, sensing permission, their earlier fear replaced by the comfort of shared blame. The mountain man did not retreat, but he did not advance either, his gaze steady, his hands open and visible, refusing to give them a reason they could use, and he said that disorder was leaving a woman to drown while pretending it was law. The words landed unevenly, some faces flushing with anger, others tightening with recognition they did not welcome. A deputy reached for the mountain man's arm and hesitated, glancing at the river and then at the bride, as if seeing the scene clearly for the first time, and the pause rippled outward, breaking the crowd's rhythm again. In that fractured moment, the mountain man leaned back just enough to speak to her over his shoulder, telling her to move when he said move, to follow the path upriver where the bank rose and the brush thickened, and though fear still rattled in her chest, she nodded, trusting the calm in his voice more than the chaos behind it. The sheriff raised his voice to reassert control, but the daylight had shifted, and as the mountain man took one measured step backward to give her room, the crowd hesitated, unsure whether to punish the man who had acted or confront the truth that his action had dragged into the open. And in that hesitation lay the thin, dangerous space where escape became possible. Now. The mountain man said it without turning, the word barely louder than the river's hiss, and she moved, stumbling at first on numb legs before finding purchase on the damp stones as she followed the narrow path he had indicated, the bank rising quickly and the brush closing in as if to hide her the moment she chose it. Behind them, the sheriff's voice sharpened, calling out orders that overlapped and contradicted each other, the sound of authority scrambling to regain shape now that daylight had been forced to acknowledge what it had almost allowed, and the crowd surged a step forward and then stalled, uncertain how far blame could safely chase a woman who was no longer dangling. The mountain man retreated in careful increments, never turning his back, using his body as a moving wall that absorbed the crowd's momentum, and when a man lunged, more from pride than intent, the mountain man shifted just enough to block him without striking, the restraint infuriating in a way violence would not have been. She reached the trees and ducked into their shade, branches whipping at her sleeves as she climbed, the smell of wet leaves and bark grounding her in something real, something not built for spectacle. And when she risked a glance back, she saw the mountain man still there, still holding the line with nothing but posture and patience. The sheriff shouted that he was obstructing justice, and the mountain man answered that justice had already been obstructed by the rope, the exchange drawing a sharp intake of breath from someone in the crowd who had not expected the truth to be named again so plainly. A deputy took a hesitant step toward the trees and stopped when the mountain man met his eyes, not with threat, but with a question left unspoken, whether this was truly the moment he wanted remembered, and the deputy's hand fell away from his belt. She pressed deeper into the woods, the sounds of the river dulling behind her as birds startled up from the undergrowth, her breath coming ragged but determined, because running now was not cowardice, but completion of the risk already taken on her behalf. At last, the mountain man broke from the bank and followed, not fleeing but withdrawing with purpose, choosing the same narrow cut she had used so the brush erased their tracks quickly. And when he reached her, he did not touch her, only guided with a tilt of his head and the steady pace of someone who knew how to move without being chased. They climbed until the ground leveled and the river noise softened into distance, and there, under the cover of pines, she stopped, hands on her knees, fighting the tremor that threatened to fold her, and the mountain man stood watch until her breathing slowed. Below them, the voices blurred and thinned, the crowd's energy breaking apart without a clear target. And in that quiet, she understood that the escape was not just from the riverbank, but from the story the crowd had been ready to tell, one where her fall explained everything, and his refusal had torn that ending away, leaving Daylight with nothing left to finish. They did not stop until the trees thinned into rock and scrub, the ground rising enough that the river's roar became a distant reminder instead of a threat. And when the mountain man finally signaled for her to sit, the strength drained from her all at once, knees giving way as she lowered herself onto a flat stone, slick with moss. The silence up there felt different from the hush after danger, heavier, as if the land itself were waiting to see what payment would be demanded for what had been taken from the crowd, and she felt it in the way the mountain man kept scanning their back trail, listening for pursuit that might not come quickly, but would come eventually. He crouched a few paces away and checked the cut on her wrists, not with urgency, but with care, tearing a strip from his own shirt to bind the rope burns, and she watched his hands move, steady despite the consequences settling in, realizing that the risk he had taken did not end at the riverbank but followed him now like a shadow that could not be outrun. She tried to thank him and found her voice uncooperative, the words catching against everything she had not yet let herself feel, and he stopped her with a small shake of his head, saying this was the easy part, that the harder thing was what came next when Daylight finished talking and men decided what stories they would carry back to town. Below them, a distant shout rose and faded, and though it did not reach their ears clearly, it was enough to tighten her chest because it meant they were being discussed, named, weighed, and she understood then that rescue did not erase danger. It simply changed its shape. The mountain man told her they would move higher before night, that people chased poorly uphill and remembered grudges longer than fatigue, and she nodded, trusting the calm certainty in his voice more than any promise of safety. As they climbed again, her steps uneven but determined, she asked him why he had stayed when others left, the question that had burned since the rope first creaked, and he answered without drama that leaving would have been easier. That ease was how he knew it was wrong, and the simplicity of it struck her harder than any explanation could have. The path narrowed and the light shifted as clouds crossed the sun, and she felt the weight of what he had given up press closer, the understanding that once a man defied a crowd in daylight, there was no quiet way back into their good graces. When they reached a ledge overlooking the valley, the mountain man paused and let her rest again, eyes sweeping the land as if memorizing escape routes rather than scenery. And she realized that his life, like hers, had just been divided into before and after by a single choice made in public. The river flashed far below, harmless now, and she understood that the true price of the risk was not measured in bruises or pursuit, but in the certainty that neither of them would ever be allowed to pretend they had not been there, had not acted, had not changed the ending the crowd had written. And as the wind moved through the pines carrying the smell of water and stone, she accepted that whatever came next would be faced together, not because he owed her anything, but because daylight had already taken its payment and left them both standing. They reached the cabin just before dusk, a low, weathered structure tucked against the slope where the pines broke the wind, and the mountain man paused long enough to listen, not for voices but for the absence of them, the kind of quiet that meant they had not been followed closely. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and iron, simple and clean. And when he set a small fire in the stone hearth, he kept it low, coaxing heat without light that could be seen from the valley, a habit born of years living where notice invited trouble. She sank onto a bench near the wall, exhaustion finally claiming its due. Now that movement was no longer demanded of her, and the mountain man set a tin cup of water within reach before stepping back again, the same careful respect he had shown by the river, never assuming closeness just because danger had pressed them together. As the fire took, its quiet warmth eased the tightness in her chest, and for the first time since the rope creaked above the water, she allowed herself to shake. The tremor passing through her in waves she did not try to stop, because stopping had been the crowd's demand, not her own. He watched without comment, feeding the fire sparingly, and when the shaking subsided, he spoke softly, saying night would cover their trail, that people were less brave in the dark when there was no audience to approve of them, and she nodded, understanding how much of what had happened depended on being seen. Outside, an owl called and was answered farther off, the sound grounding her in a world larger than the riverbank, larger than the crowd's certainty, and she realized how close she had come to being reduced to a single moment that would have ended everything. The mountain man asked her name then, not as a formality but as an offering, and when she gave it, he repeated it once, careful and unhurried, as if anchoring something that had nearly been lost to the current. She asked his in return, and he gave it just as simply, neither of them dressing the exchange in meaning, yet both aware that names spoken in safety carried a different weight than those shouted by strangers. They shared a piece of bread and dried meat, the meal plain but steady, and the act of eating felt like reclaiming time that had been stolen earlier, minute by minute, second by second. When the fire burned down to coals, he banked it and checked the door, setting a bar quietly into place, and she watched the practiced motions, seeing not secrecy but care, the kind that anticipated need rather than danger. As night settled fully and the cabin held its small circle of warmth, she understood that what bound them now was not the drama of rescue, but the quieter work of staying, of choosing to let the risk they had taken mean something beyond survival. And as sleep finally edged close, she felt the strange, steady comfort of knowing that daylight had failed to finish her, and darkness had not come to claim the debt, leaving them instead with a fire that asked for nothing more than patience to keep it alive. She woke to the sound before she understood it, a faint scrape carried through the cabin wall that did not belong to wind or settling wood, and she held her breath as the mountain man rose in one smooth motion from his chair, already awake in the way men were when sleep was only a pause. He eased the door open a hand's width and listened, the night pressing close and cold, and outside, the pines stood still enough to make every small noise matter, the distant river reduced to a low, steady presence that no longer dominated the dark. Somewhere downslope, a stone shifted and then another, deliberate this time, followed by the hush of boots trying to learn silence too late, and the mountain man closed the door again, setting the bar without sound, his eyes meeting hers with a calm that steadied rather than warned. He gestured for her to stay low and moved to the back of the cabin, slipping out through the narrow rear opening he had cut years earlier for exactly this reason, and she followed as quietly as her stiff legs allowed, the cold night air biting her lungs as they stepped into the trees behind the structure. The ground fell away quickly there, a steep cut laced with roots and rock, and the mountain man guided her along it with practiced certainty, choosing shadow over speed, because pursuit relied on confidence as much as numbers. Below them, voices rose in frustrated murmurs, a man cursing softly as another told him to keep quiet, and she recognized the tone immediately, the same borrowed boldness she had heard by the river when daylight had promised approval. The mountain man paused at a break in the slope and listened again, counting breath and distance, then angled them higher, away from the path most people would expect, because hunters followed habits, and men pretending to hunt followed them more closely. Branches caught at her dress and she nearly stumbled, but he caught her elbow briefly and released it at once, the touch efficient and gone, a reminder that support did not need to linger to be real. The voices drifted closer and then stalled, confusion replacing certainty as the ground refused to offer an easy line upward, and she realized how much of what chased them depended on familiarity, on paths worn by agreement rather than necessity. The mountain man waited until the men below argued in whispers, then moved again, leading her across a narrow traverse where the drop fell away sharply, trusting her balance without asking, and she focused on each step, grounding herself in the feel of rock beneath her boots rather than the fear pressing at her back. When they reached a shelf of stone overlooking the cabin's dark roof, they stopped, watching as lantern light bobbed uselessly in the trees below, the search spreading thin as frustration set in. One man suggested going back at first light, another insisted they had the right trail, and the disagreement frayed what little resolve they carried, until finally the lights drifted away, swallowed by distance and pride. The mountain man exhaled slowly and guided her farther upslope, not returning to the cabin, but choosing the safer truth that once danger showed its face, it rarely left politely. As they climbed, the night opened around them, quiet and watchful, and she understood that the risk he had taken by the river was still unfolding, not as a single act, but as a series of careful refusals, each one denying the crowd the ending it wanted, and with every step away from the voices below, she felt the certainty grow that whatever daylight had tried to finish, it would not reach them here, where patience and terrain answered louder than anger ever could. By first light, they had climbed beyond the ridgeline into a stretch of broken ground, where the valley opened wide and sound carried poorly, the wind smoothing edges until even memory felt quieter. And she noticed how her body responded to the distance, shoulders easing, breath finding a rhythm that did not flinch at every bird call. The mountain man chose a narrow saddle between outcrops and let her rest there, the stone still cool with night while he scanned the land below, eyes tracing the paths men favored and the ones they avoided, reading absence as carefully as presence. Far off, a thin column of smoke marked the town, harmless from here, and she felt a strange gratitude that the place which had nearly ended her now looked small enough to fit in a palm, a reminder that cruelty shrank when removed from its audience. She washed her wrists in a seep that threaded through the rocks, the water stinging and then soothing, and as the last of the rope fibers loosened from her skin, she watched them drift away, carried off by something stronger than fear. The mountain man spoke quietly of moving north through country that asked little of names and less of permission, of work that measured a person by what they could do rather than what others decided to see. And he did not ask her to follow, only laid the road out as it was, open and honest. And she realized how much of her life had been spent choosing between worse options rather than choosing at all. A hawk circled above the saddle, riding the air without effort, and the sight steadied her because it needed no witness to justify its place. When she asked whether the men below would try again, he answered that they might tell the story first, that stories were safer than pursuit, and that once a crowd agreed on a version, it preferred to keep it at a distance where it could not be challenged. She understood then that survival was not only about escaping the rope or the river, but about refusing to carry the version of herself that would make the crowd comfortable, and the thought settled into her like resolve. They moved on together as the sun lifted, the path rising gently now, grass replacing rock, and with each step she felt the day's weight shift from her shoulders into the ground beneath her boots. The mountain man slowed when the trail widened, letting her take the lead, a small gesture that mattered more than words because it placed her future ahead rather than behind. When they reached a point where the valley fell away entirely and the land ahead rolled clean and open, she stopped and turned once more, not to look back at the river, but to acknowledge the line she had crossed, the one daylight had drawn, and she had stepped beyond. The wind carried no voices now, no orders, no laughter sharpened into law, and in that quiet, she understood that what had saved her was not only a blade or a hand, but the refusal to accept an ending chosen by others. And as they continued on, the crowd's hunger finally spent itself on distance, leaving behind a silence that felt earned and a future that no longer needed permission to begin. They reached the open valley just as the sun cleared the far ridge, light spilling across the grass in a way that felt earned rather than exposed, and she paused there without being told, breathing in air that no longer smelled of river spray or fear, her body still marked but no longer claimed. The mountain man stopped a few steps behind her, giving the moment its space, understanding that some crossings needed to be recognized even when no one was watching. And as the wind moved through the valley, she felt the last tight knot inside her chest finally loosen, the one tied not by the rope, but by the certainty that she had almost been finished in public and would have been remembered only as a lesson. She told him then that when she had been left hanging, it wasn't the fall she feared most, but the agreement, the way so many people had decided together that her life was expendable, and he listened without interrupting, nodding once as if filing the truth where it belonged. He answered that the risk he took was never really about the river, that rivers always took what they were given, but about refusing the lie that some endings were necessary for order to hold, and the simplicity of it settled between them like a shared understanding. They walked again, side by side now, not hurried, not cautious, and she noticed how different movement felt when it was chosen rather than forced, each step an act of ownership rather than escape. The valley offered no shelter and no threat, only distance, and she realized that distance itself was a kind of justice, the kind that did not demand witnesses or approval. When they stopped near a stand of cottonwoods, he told her this was as far as he would go, that his path bent west toward higher ground and solitude. He understood, and she felt the quiet weight of parting rise without pain, because nothing between them needed to be held tighter to matter. She thanked him then, not for saving her life, but for taking the risk that allowed her to keep it as her own, and he accepted the thanks with a nod, as if it belonged to the choice rather than to him. They stood there a moment longer, the space between them unburdened by promises or claims, and when he turned away, his figure moving back toward the mountains, she did not feel abandoned, only complete. She continued north alone, the sun warming her face, the land open ahead, and with every step she carried the quiet certainty that daylight had tried and failed to decide her worth, that the crowd's ending had been interrupted not by chance, but by a man who refused to look away, and that what remained was hers now. A life no longer hanging, no longer borrowed, but fully held, steady as the river she had left behind, and strong enough to move forward without needing to be carried again. Some injustices are loud enough to happen in daylight, others survive because no one takes the risk of stopping them. This was a story about a woman left to fall and a man who chose. To step forward when walking away would have been easier. And sometimes that single risk is enough to take the ending away from a crowd that never deserved it.